Live NFL trivia every Tuesday night on Twitch at 9 p.m. Eastern. Come show off your football knowledge and have a chance to win cash prizes. Check the link in the description to find out more. And now, on with our feature presentation. When a player violates team policy, often they will be suspended by their head coach. Maybe it's because they missed the practice. Maybe it's because they fought a teammate or said something that went against the team's conduct. Maybe it's because they were late for a team flight or a team meeting. Whatever the case may be, these things are not entirely unusual, and there's usually a handful of incidents per year where a player will be suspended in the middle of the season by their team. But imagine if Commissioner Roger Goodell went to the team after the suspension was announced and said, "Nope, you can't do that. You can't suspend this player. You have to figure out some other punishment. Do what you want with him, but you cannot suspend him anymore." You don't see the commissioner interfering with the head coach's duties and telling him what he can and cannot do with the players on his team. Yet in 1972, that's exactly what happened with Commissioner Pete Rozelle and the New England Patriots. Head coach Phil Bengtson suspended a player, and Rozelle ordered him to lift the suspension. And this is the story behind the drama of the 1972 Patriots. Before I talk about the incident in question, we need some context as to the player that got suspended, so we can understand how much of a star we are talking about here. The main character of our story is running back Carl Garrett. He was drafted by the Patriots, then known as the Boston Patriots, in the third round of the 1969 NFL-AFL draft, hoping to improve a running attack that ranked dead last in the AFL in both rushing yards and touchdowns during the 1968 season. And the expectations were ridiculously high for Garrett after he said in the offseason, when the season's over, they'll be talking about Carl Garrett and not O.J. Simpson. Sure enough, Garrett burst onto the scene and became one of the top runners in the league. He didn't quite live up to that promise, but he still played incredibly well. As a rookie, he led the entire AFL in yards per carry, averaging an incredible 5 yards per attempt. He became the first player in Patriots history to ever finish as the league leader in this category, and to this day is one of just 3 runners in franchise history to accomplish this feat. He had close to 1,000 yards from scrimmage, which led the team, and he led the team with 7 touchdowns as well. For his efforts, Garrett was named an AFL All-Star. The future was looking really bright for Garrett. However, he fell victim to the sophomore slump. During that 1970 season, instead of building off of that strong rookie campaign, he faltered heavily. His 5 yards per carry dropped to a mere 3.1 yards per carry. He only found the end zone 4 times, and his yards from scrimmage, despite starting more games than he did in 1969, were cut in half. Garrett would be placed on the trading block after that poor season, though nothing came of it. And to his credit, when 1971 rolled around, he looked like his old self again, setting a career high in yards from scrimmage with 1,049 and scoring the game-winning fourth-quarter touchdown in a 21-17 victory over the Buffalo Bills. There was not a whole lot to like on those Patriots teams around the turn of the decade, but for the most part, Carl Garrett was a bright spot, who at times was an absolutely electrifying player. But during that 1972 season, everything would change. I think it goes without saying that the 1990 season was the worst season in Patriots history. Not going to make any arguments against that, as everything that could go wrong that year did. But in terms of the second worst season, while there are a lot of strong contenders from 1970 to 81 to 92, you can make a pretty strong argument for 1972. Because in 1972, to say that the Patriots were bad and were one of the worst teams in professional football would be a massive understatement. Their first game against the Cincinnati Bengals, which was a blowout 31-7 loss where they turned the ball over 3 times, had just 137 yards in total offense, and picked up a grand total of 9 first downs, was a bad sign of things to come. I should note that they did start the season 2-1, with one of those wins being a highly controversial victory against Washington, which you can learn more about by clicking the card in the upper right corner. After that game, though, everything came crumbling down. The Patriots proceeded to lose their next 6 games. And it's not just that they lost their next 6, it was the way they lost these games. 5 of these 6 losses were by at least 24 points. Over this stretch, the Patriots got outscored 222-57 and turned the ball over 19 times, which means that on average, the Pats were losing games over this time period by 27.5 points. One of those losses was a 52-0 loss to Miami. Another one was a 34-10 loss to the Jets, where they trailed 34-3 late in the fourth quarter. Another was a 38-14 loss to the Bills, where they trailed 38-7 late in the fourth quarter. Basically, what I'm saying is that even though the Pats got blown out almost every week during that stretch, the scores were still not a true indication of how well that game went, because oftentimes, the game was actually worse than what the final box score said it was. However, despite this awful run of play, the one guy who was actually doing well and was making people still believe that the Patriots were not a bunch of amateurs disguising as a professional football team was Carl Garrett. Over that 6-game stretch, he had 628 yards from scrimmage, so he was averaging over 100 yards per game. while at the same time comfortably averaging over 4 yards per carry. Between that stretch and the game-winning touchdown he had in the fourth quarter to beat the Atlanta Falcons earlier in the year, he was the one thing that the Pats actually had going for them. And unfortunately for him, he was about to be suspended. Following that awful 6-game stretch, the Patriots announced a coaching change. John Mazur was out. In his place was Phil Bengtson. If that name sounds familiar to you, he's the answer to the trivia question of who replaced Vince Lombardi as the head coach of the Green Bay Packers. And as a disciple of Lombardi, having served as Lombardi's defensive coordinator throughout his entire tenure, you know there was zero tolerance for missing practice. Sure enough, Garrett missed the practice. Keep in mind that this was not the first time that Garrett missed practice. He was just never punished for it under Coach Mazur. Even though he had been fined for missing practice, as Garrett said, "No one ever told me I'd be suspended. Coach Mazur just said the fines would get bigger." Well, under Coach Bengtson, this was not going to fly. His players were going to practice, and if they didn't practice, well, they just weren't going to play. And with that, not even 48 hours after taking over as the interim head coach, Bengtson suspended Garrett for the remainder of the season. This was his statement. And obviously, Garrett was not thrilled about this at all. He asked the Patriots to either reinstate him or release him so that he could play elsewhere. His attorney, George Ruboy, said that what the Patriots were doing was not allowed, because it denies him the right to work. Now, I don't know about you, but that's kind of the whole point of a suspension. Bengtson didn't bite. The team's best offensive weapon and the only saving grace on that awful team was still going to be absent for the team's Week 10 game against Buffalo, which the Patriots lost. He was also absent for the Week 11 game against Baltimore, which the Patriots lost. And he was absent for the Week 12 game against Miami, which the Patriots lost. Garrett had been suspended for 3 games, and there were no signs of Bengtson overruling this decision. That's when Pete Rozelle stepped in. After Rozelle and Garrett's representatives met for 6 hours in New York, the commissioner ordered that Bengtson lift the suspension and make Garrett play. The commissioner was telling the Patriots to play their running back for football reasons. Understandably, Bengtson did not agree with this at all. He said that in his 37 years of football, he had never seen anything like what Garrett was doing. However, he reluctantly agreed to accept him as a part of the team, because the commissioner sent him an order telling him to do so. With that, after missing 3 games, the best player on the Patriots was back with the team. And how does this story end? As you can probably expect, it doesn't end too well for either side. Garrett played the final 2 games. While he struggled heavily against the Saints, averaging a season-low 1.8 yards per carry and picking up just 30 yards on the ground, he bounced back the following week against the Denver Broncos, when he found the end zone twice in a 45-21 loss. The Patriots were not good in 1972, finishing the season with a 3-11 record and hiring a brand new head coach in 1973, with Chuck Fairbanks taking over both the head coaching and general manager duties. And its first order of business, or one of them at the very least, was to get rid of Garrett. Whether it was because of the offer made to them, or whether it was because he just didn't want to deal with the headache and play a guessing game of whether or not he was actually going to show up to practice, or whether it was a combination of both is unknown. However, during the 1973 offseason, the Patriots traded Garrett away to the Chicago Bears for a first-round pick. Understandably, the team was upset about the move. One player said, "I can't see trading a proven veteran for a draft pick." Another one, guard Mike Montler, summed it up bluntly by saying, "We just traded away the best football player on our team. This trade staggers me." Just like that, the top offensive weapon on the Patriots, and a guy who would have easily been on pace to set a career high in yards from scrimmage if he wasn't suspended in 1972, was gone. How did this trade work out for both sides? The good news for New England is that it seemed like they made the right move. Garrett didn't do much of anything with the Bears, and he was gone after the 1974 season. He only averaged 3.7 yards per carry in Chicago, which was a steep decline from what he was doing in New England, and had just 1,400 yards from scrimmage over those 2 years with the Bears. For giving up a first-round pick, the Bears definitely expected more out of him. As for what the Patriots did with that pick, they used the pick, the last of their 3 first-round picks that year, on Purdue wide receiver Darryl Stingley. The story behind him is pretty tragic, as after a career-best year in 1977, and after serving as the team's starting receiver for 3 straight years, he got injured after a hit by Jack Tatum in a 1978 preseason game. And not only did he never play again, but he suffered paralysis. I'm not going to show you the hit because it is truly bad, but if you are curious, the hit is easily findable on YouTube and elsewhere, but I must warn you to view that at your own discretion. The 1972 Patriots were a bad football team, and they were also a dysfunctional football team. That's always a recipe for disaster. And the end result was a disaster so bad that the commissioner of football himself had to step in and intervene. Normally, you see the commissioner handing out suspensions and keeping players from returning to the field. But in 1972, the commissioner, oddly enough, was the one putting a stop to them. Be sure to like this video, ring the notification bell, subscribe down below if you haven't already, so it helps the channel out a lot. And be sure to check out Twitch every Monday and Tuesday night at 9 p.m. Eastern for your chance to play NFL Trivia and win cash prizes. Link in the description below. If you want to see videos like this condensed down to 60 seconds, then follow me on TikTok at JRGator9 and subscribe to 60-second NFL History on YouTube. To see highlight videos of players throughout the history of the NFL, subscribe to JG9 Highlights. Also, special thanks to all of our Patreon supporters for helping with the channel. Your support is greatly appreciated. So you can become a patron and request future video topics in the description below.